Continuation of Chapter 12. Abandonment Worse than Persecution. The communists are afraid of those who attack them publicly. Those who were behind the Iron Curtain would have felt themselves to be supported by the Holy See, and understood by all the Catholics who do not live under a communist regime. It would have given them real courage, whereas in the absence of this clear stance, they felt anguished, and wondered if they were still supported, and if their combat were still approved by Rome. This is the case of the Lithuanians, who often wonder if the combat they are engaged in today is approved by the Holy See, because they notice that in a number of states, the bishops who are being named, like Bishop Lefebvre in Hungary or Bishop Tomasek in Czechoslovakia, silence and shunt aside the priests who fight against communism. They experience something like what is happening to us in the Church, and yet which is not behind the Iron Curtain. They would like to silence us. They would like to suppress us. Over there, it is the same thing. In the countries situated behind the Iron Curtain, it is actually the cardinals and those who are in episcopal curias who forbid people to fight or oppose the communist government. So they no longer know what they should do. They wonder if the Church is still against atheistic communism or not. For them, it is an anguish even more terrible than persecution. When you are persecuted, you defend the Church, you defend the faith. But to not know whether one's reason for fighting, for which one may endure prison and torture, is approved or not by the Church, is worse. Not to know whether their own leaders or superiors are with them or against them causes a greater moral suffering than the physical pain that they endure in the prisons. It is somewhat the same thing for us. To be chased and disliked by the episcopal authorities is a cause of great suffering. But for Rome to shunt us aside and despise us is worse, because we wonder if the Church approves of our combat against the modern errors, the same combat of the popes for 2 centuries. Should the fight against errors cease? Should the fight for truth be abandoned? Unthinkable. And this suffering is increased when we consider what the Church has become since Vatican II. It is extremely painful for many Catholics. How many laymen and priests suffer a real martyrdom from this situation? They no longer know what to think, whereas before everything was clear. With those popes, it was the whole Church that fought. One no longer knows what to think. They no longer want to fight communism openly, and yet the Pope has lived under a communist regime. Since his accession to the pontificate, has he ever said or read or written anything where he openly took a stand against communism? Perhaps he has alluded to it on one occasion or other, but there is no real combat against this revolution which, as Pope Pius XI wrote, is, quote, the most horrible that has ever been endured, end quote. Aggravation of the Peril. Before writing his encyclical, Pope Pius XI had already addressed the topic frequently. Quote, "To our great satisfaction, venerable brethren, You have, by means of individual and even joint pastoral letters, accurately transmitted and explained to the faithful these admonitions." End quote. He congratulates the bishops for having disseminated his declarations. The Pope continues, quote, "Yet, despite our frequent and paternal warnings, the peril only grows greater from day to day because of the pressure exerted by clever agitators." End quote. In all the papal documents, we find the observation that, despite their warnings, the evil spreads. It would seem that, to try us, despite all that the popes have done to combat evil, God permits us to be unable to uproot the errors and halt the flood of false ideas that, for the last 2 or 3 centuries, has been dragging the world to its destruction. Quote, "Therefore, we believe it to be our duty to raise our voice once more in a still more solemn missive, in accord with the desire of the whole Catholic world, which makes the appearance of such a document but natural. We trust that the echo of our voice will reach every mind free from prejudice and every heart sincerely desirous of the good of mankind. We wish this the more because our words are now receiving sorry confirmation from the spectacle of the bitter fruits of subversive ideas, which we foresaw and foretold, and which are in fact multiplying fearfully in the countries already stricken, or threatening every other country of the world." End quote. It can be said that the Pope was right. If he were to return, he could say that he had foreseen it. Since Pius XI, how many nations that were not yet enslaved have fallen under the yoke of the communists? There were almost none in Africa. Russia and China were under communist domination, but in the Far East, Vietnam had not yet fallen to communist regimes. In Africa now, almost half the continent has fallen into communist hands. To complete the survey, it would be necessary to include the Americas, Mexico, Central America, Cuba, as well as to consider the penetration of communist influence in the so-called free countries. The communists have made enormous progress in Italy, France, and Spain, where they have made a comeback. It is quite worrisome. The Imposture Decried. Quote, "Hence, we wish to expose once more in a brief synthesis the principles of atheistic communism as they are manifested chiefly in Bolshevism. We wish also to indicate its method of action and to contrast with its false principles the clear doctrine of the Church, in order to inculcate anew and with greater insistence the means by which Christian civilization, the true civitas humana, can be saved from the satanic scourge, and not merely saved, but better developed for the well-being of human society." End quote. In the second part, Pius XI describes the theory and practice of the communists. Counterfeit redemption of the poor. Quote, "The communism of today, more emphatically than similar movements in the past, conceals in itself a false messianic idea." End quote. This is how the Pope understands communism. Communism presents itself to the world as the redemption of the lowly, coming to bring salvation to the poor, the wretched, the hungry. It is a counter-redemption, so to speak, as the devil is wont to do. He imitates to a certain degree the Christian religion, as it was our Lord who truly came to bring redemption to souls and Christian civilization the most beautiful of civilizations. So, to destroy this Christian civilization, it is necessary to present to the world a kind of counterfeit redemption. They have concocted this strategy, present themselves to the world as those who bring redemption to the lowly. Quote, a pseudo-ideal of justice, of equality and fraternity in labor impregnates all its doctrine and activity with a deceptive mysticism. End quote. And indeed, the communists present themselves as animated by a real mystique, as having a new religion and a new gospel. This is the means they use to ensnare the humble, by calling themselves the liberators of the poor and the workers. Quote, which communicates a zealous and contagious enthusiasm to the multitudes entrapped by delusive promises. This is especially true in an age like ours, when unusual misery has resulted from the unequal distribution of the goods of this world. End quote.